I signed the contract in early June, inside a cramped Forest Service office that smelled of wet nylon and burned coffee. The woman behind the desk never looked at me, just slid the papers over and tapped where I needed to sign. Orientation was at 7 in the morning the next day. No welcome, no questions. The title sounded official, Natural Resources Technician. But the work was simple. Long boat runs, empty islands, reports no one read. I took every assignment they offered, especially the ones no one else wanted. Early departures, rough water, days without cell service, anything that kept me out of town. In Alaska, isolation was not a side effect of the job. It was the job. My name is Samuel Whitmore, and I came to the Tongass National Forest to disappear. Not in the literal sense, though after everything that happened, I understand how thin that line really is. I came because I needed distance from the life I had been living in Oregon, a failed marriage, a business that collapsed, a brother I could no longer speak to without shouting. Alaska promised silence, and for a while, it delivered. The Tongass is the largest national forest in the United States. 17 million acres of temperate rainforest spanning the Alexander Archipelago and the coastal mountains of southeast Alaska. Most people picture Alaska as a frozen wasteland, but the Tongass is different. It is wet, it is green, it is dense in ways that forests in the lower 48 cannot comprehend. The trees here, Sitka spruce, western hemlock, red cedar, grow so thick that sunlight becomes a rumor. The moss hangs from every branch like the hair of drowned women. The rain never stops, not really. It just pauses long enough to let you forget it is coming. I was stationed out of Ketchikan, a small town built on a rocky island at the southern tip of the archipelago. The locals called it the salmon capital of the world, though I never saw much evidence of that title during my time there. What I saw were fishing boats, float planes, and a constant gray ceiling of clouds that seemed to press down on everything. The town itself clung to the mountainside like it was afraid of falling into the water. The streets were steep, the buildings were old, and everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. I rented a room above a bait shop on Creek Street. The floor sloped, the walls were thin, and I could hear the water running beneath the building at all hours. It was perfect. I did not want comfort. I wanted to be reminded, constantly, that I was somewhere else, somewhere far from everything I had known. My supervisor was a man named Franklin Delacroix. He was 63 years old, had worked for the Forest Service for 41 years, and possessed the kind of quiet authority that made younger men listen without question. He was tall and lean, with a gray beard that he kept trimmed close to his jaw and eyes that had seen too much water. Franklin never raised his voice. He never needed to. When he told you something, you believed it. Not because he demanded belief, but because everything about him suggested he had earned the right to be taken seriously. On my third day, Franklin called me into his office, a converted storage room at the back of the Ketchikan Ranger Station. The walls were covered with maps, most of them hand-annotated with faded pencil marks. There were photographs too, black and white images of men standing in front of boats and cabins, their faces serious, their clothes soaked. Franklin gestured for me to sit. I did. He studied me for a long moment before speaking. His voice was low and even, like a boat engine idling in calm water. "You came here to get away from something," he said. "That is not a question. I can see it in how you move, how you avoid eye contact, how you volunteered for the Heseda run before you even knew what it was." I did not respond. There was nothing to say. Franklin nodded slowly, as if my silence confirmed something he already knew. "That is fine," he said. "Most of the men who work this job are running from something. The forest does not care why you came. It only cares whether you can do the work." He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands across his stomach. "But I need to tell you something, Samuel. Something that is not in the manual. Something that orientation did not cover." I waited. Franklin's eyes drifted to the window. Outside, the rain was falling in sheets, turning the harbor into a gray blur. "There are places in the Tongass that do not appear on any official map," he said. "Islands that the Forest Service knows about but does not acknowledge. Cabins that were built by men whose names have been forgotten. Trails that lead to nowhere, or worse, to somewhere." He paused, letting the words settle. "You will hear stories from the old-timers," he continued. "Stories about people who went into the forest and never came back. Stories about sounds in the night that do not match any animal in the region. Stories about things seen at the edge of the tree line, just before dark. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to tell him that I was too old for campfire tales, that I had not come to Alaska to be frightened by ghost stories. But something in his expression stopped me. He was not trying to scare me. He was trying to warn me. Most of those stories are nonsense, Franklin said. Exaggerations, misremembered details. The human mind does strange things when it is alone for too long. But some of those stories, Samuel, some of them are true. And if you work this job long enough, you will have your own story to tell. He stood up and walked to the window, his back to me. I have been doing this for 4 decades, he said. I have seen things I cannot explain. Things I have never reported because no one would believe me. Things I have never told my wife or my children or anyone outside this office. He turned to face me, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that I had not expected. Fear. Not the sharp, immediate fear of a man facing danger, but the slow, deep fear of a man who has lived with something terrible for a very long time. The Tongass is not just a forest, Samuel. It is something older. Something that was here before the Tlingit, before the glaciers, before anything that we would recognize as life. And it remembers. It remembers everything. He walked back to his desk and sat down heavily, as if the conversation had drained something from him. I am not telling you this to scare you, he said. I am telling you this because you need to know. Because when you are out there, alone, and something happens that does not make sense, I want you to remember this conversation. I want you to know that you are not crazy, that other men have seen what you will see, and that the best thing you can do when you see it is to leave. Do not investigate. Do not try to understand. Just leave. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder, which he slid across the desk toward me. This is your first real assignment, he said. His voice had returned to its normal, business-like tone, as if the previous conversation had never happened. Heseda Island, 3-day survey. You will be checking on one of our remote cabins and documenting any wildlife activity in the area. Simple work. I picked up the folder and opened it. Inside were maps, photographs, and a series of typed reports dating back to the 1970s. The cabin in question was located on the northern shore of Heseda Island, accessible only by boat. The nearest town was Craig, about 20 miles to the east. The reports were routine: weather observations, wildlife sightings, maintenance notes. Nothing unusual. You will leave tomorrow morning at 6, Franklin said. Take the whaler. Pack for 4 days, just in case the weather turns. There is a satellite phone in the cabin, but the reception is unreliable. If you need to reach us, use the radio. I nodded and stood to leave. At the door, I paused and looked back at Franklin. He was staring at the window again, his face unreadable. What happened to the last person who had this assignment? I asked. Franklin did not turn around. He quit, he said. After 3 weeks, said he could not sleep anymore. Said he kept hearing voices outside the cabin at night, voices that knew his name. I waited for him to continue, but he said nothing more. I left the office and walked out into the rain, the folder tucked under my arm, Franklin's words echoing in my head. The Tongass is not just a forest. It is something older, something that remembers. At the time, I thought he was being dramatic. I thought it was some kind of initiation ritual, a way of testing the new guy, seeing if he would spook easily. I had no idea how wrong I was. I had no idea what was waiting for me on Heseda Island. I had no idea that by the end of that summer, I would understand exactly what Franklin meant. And that understanding would change everything I thought I knew about the world, about the forest, and about myself. I left Ketchikan at 6 in the morning, just as Franklin had instructed. The sky was the color of wet concrete, and a light rain was falling, turning the harbor into a forest of masts and rigging that swayed gently in the early morning swell. The boat was a 22-foot Boston whaler, painted Forest Service green, with a center console and a canvas top that did little to keep out the rain. I loaded my gear: tent, sleeping bag, food for 4 days, water, first aid kit, rifle, ammunition, radio, flashlight, extra batteries, rain gear, maps, compass, notebook, camera, and cast off from the dock at 6:15. The crossing to Heseda Island took about 4 hours. I followed the inside passage, threading my way between islands that rose from the water like the humped backs of sleeping giants. The forest came right down to the shoreline on most of them, a solid wall of green that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Occasionally, I would pass a fishing boat or a kayaker, but for the most part, I was alone on the water, surrounded by silence broken only by the steady drone of the outboard motor. I had studied the maps the night before, memorizing the route, noting the landmarks, identifying the hazards. Heseda Island was one of the larger islands in the archipelago, about 40 miles long and 10 miles wide at its widest point. Most of it was uninhabited, covered with old-growth forest that had never been logged. There were a few small settlements on the eastern shore, mostly fishing camps and seasonal cabins, but the northern shore, where the Forest Service cabin was located, was completely wild. The cabin itself had been built in 1932 by a man named Ezekiel Marsh. According to the reports in the folder, Marsh was a trapper who had come to Alaska during the Depression, hoping to make his fortune in furs. He built the cabin as a base of operations, spending his winters running trap lines through the forest and his summers fishing for salmon in the surrounding waters. He lived there alone for 18 years, until 1950, when he simply disappeared. His cabin was found empty, his boat still tied to the dock, his gear still inside. There was food on the table, as if he had been in the middle of a meal when something interrupted him. The Forest Service acquired the cabin in 1954 and had been using it as a remote station ever since. Dozens of rangers and researchers had stayed there over the years, conducting surveys, monitoring wildlife, maintaining trails. Most of them reported nothing unusual, but a few, a small but persistent minority, reported experiences that did not fit neatly into any official category. Strange sounds at night, the feeling of being watched, objects that moved when no one was looking, and in 3 separate cases, the same detail that Franklin had mentioned, voices outside the cabin that knew the listener's name. I arrived at Heceta Island just before 11 in the morning. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still overcast, and a thick mist hung over the water, reducing visibility to a few hundred yards. I followed the shoreline north, using my compass and the occasional landmark to navigate, until I spotted the cabin, a small wooden structure set back from the water on a low bluff, surrounded by towering spruce trees. The dock was old but sturdy, built from logs that had weathered to a silvery gray. I tied off the whaler and climbed onto the planks, my boots echoing in the silence. The air smelled of salt and pine and something else. Something faintly organic that I could not identify. Decay maybe, or moss, or something that had been dead for a very long time. The cabin was exactly as the photographs had shown it. A single-story structure with a pitched roof, a small porch, and 2 windows facing the water. The walls were made of hand-hewn logs, chinked with some kind of gray morite that had cracked and crumbled in places. The roof was covered with cedar shakes, many of them missing or broken. The door was painted red, though the paint had faded and peeled until it was more pink than anything else. I climbed the steps to the porch and tried the door. It was unlocked, as Franklin had said it would be. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior of the cabin was dim and musty, lit only by the gray light filtering through the dirty windows. There was a single room, about 15 feet square, with a wooden floor, a stone fireplace, a narrow bed against one wall, a table and 2 chairs in the center, and a small kitchen area in the back corner. The walls were bare except for a few hooks where previous occupants had hung their gear. There was a layer of dust on everything, and the air had that particular stillness that comes from long disuse. I set down my pack and walked slowly around the room, taking inventory. The fireplace was cold, the ashes long since turned to powder. The bed was made, the blankets folded neatly at the foot. The table was clear except for an old kerosene lantern and a stack of yellowed papers that turned out to be survey forms from 1987. The kitchen had a hand pump for water, a propane stove that looked like it dated from the 50s, and a row of cabinets that contained a few cans of beans, some instant coffee, and a family of mice that fled when I opened the door. In the back corner, I found the satellite phone and the radio, both mounted on a small shelf. I tested the radio first. It crackled to life, and I was able to raise the Ketchikan station on the second try. I reported my arrival, confirmed my schedule, and signed off. The satellite phone was another matter. When I picked it up, the screen was blank. I checked the battery, checked the connections, tried turning it on and off several times. Nothing. It was completely dead. I made a note in my notebook. Satellite phone inoperative. Will report to station on return, and continued my inspection. The last thing I found was a trapdoor in the floor, near the back of the cabin. It was about 3 feet square, set flush with the floorboards, with a heavy iron ring for a handle. I pulled it open and shone my flashlight into the darkness below. The beam revealed a small root cellar, maybe 6 feet deep and 8 feet across, with earthen walls and a dirt floor. There were a few shelves along the walls, holding jars of what looked like preserved vegetables, long since turned to brown sludge. There was also a wooden crate in the center of the floor, nailed shut. I climbed down the ladder and examined the crate. It was old, very old, and the wood was soft with rot. The nails were rusted, and when I pulled at one of the boards, it came away easily. Inside the crate, wrapped in oilcloth, were the personal effects of Ezekiel Marsh. There was a leather-bound journal, the pages brittle and yellow. There was a pocket watch, stopped at 3:17. There was a photograph of a woman I did not recognize, her face stern and unsmiling in the way of old portraits. And there was a knife. A hunting knife with a bone handle and a blade that was still sharp despite the decades. I took the journal and left the rest. I climbed back up the ladder, closed the trap door, and sat down at the table to read. The journal began in 1932, the year Marsh built the cabin. The early entries were mundane, notes about construction, weather observations, lists of supplies, accounts of successful hunts. Marsh wrote in a cramped, careful hand, his spelling inconsistent, but his meaning clear. He was a practical man, focused on survival, with little time for reflection or philosophy. But as I read further, the tone of the entries began to change. By 1935, Marsh was writing about things that did not fit the pattern of the earlier pages. He mentioned sounds in the forest at night, sounds that he could not identify, that did not match any animal he knew. He wrote about the feeling of being watched, a constant presence that he could sense but never see. He described dreams, vivid, disturbing dreams in which he wandered through the forest, searching for something he could never find, pursued by something he could never escape. In 1938, the entries became more fragmented. Marsh wrote about seeing figures at the edge of the tree line, tall, thin shapes that moved in ways that did not seem natural. He wrote about voices that called to him from the forest, voices that knew his name, that whispered secrets he could not quite hear. He wrote about losing time, hours, sometimes entire days, that he could not account for, that left no memory except a vague sense of dread. The final entry was dated October 15, 1949, 6 months before Marsh disappeared. It was shorter than the others, just a few lines scrawled in a hand that trembled. "It is here," he wrote. "It has always been here. I understand now. I know what it wants. I know what I have to do. May God forgive me." I closed the journal and sat in the silence of the cabin, the weight of those words pressing down on me. Outside, the mist had thickened, and the forest was invisible, swallowed by a gray wall that seemed to press against the windows. The only sound was the soft drip of water from the eaves, steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. I told myself that Marsh was crazy, that 18 years alone in the wilderness had broken something in his mind, that the things he described, the sounds, the figures, the voices, were nothing more than the hallucinations of a man who had spent too long without human contact. I told myself that there was a rational explanation for everything. I told myself that I was not afraid. But as I sat there, in that dim and dusty cabin, listening to the silence of the forest, I felt something I had not expected, a sense of recognition. A feeling that I had been here before, in a place just like this, in a moment just like this, waiting for something I could not name. It was not fear exactly. It was more like anticipation, like the forest was watching me, weighing me, deciding what to do. And somewhere, deep in the trees, something was waiting. I spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking my gear and making the cabin habitable. I swept the floors, aired out the blankets, checked the propane stove, and gathered enough firewood to last several days. The work was simple and physical, and it helped to quiet the unease that had settled over me since reading Marsh's journal. By the time I finished, it was late afternoon, and the mist had begun to lift. I walked down to the dock and stood there for a while, watching the water. The surface was calm, almost glassy, reflecting the dark shapes of the trees on the opposite shore. There were no birds, no fish jumping, no sound except the soft lap of water against the pilings. I had never been in a place so quiet. It was not peaceful, it was empty, as if the world had been drained of something essential, leaving only the shell behind. I returned to the cabin as the light began to fade. I cooked a simple dinner, beans, rice, coffee, and ate at the table, the kerosene lantern casting a flickering circle of light around me. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper than they should have been, and I found myself glancing toward the windows more often than was necessary, half expecting to see something looking back. After dinner, I took out my notebook and began writing my report. Wildlife observations, none so far. Weather conditions, overcast. Light rain in the morning, mist in the afternoon, clearing toward evening. Cabin status, habitable but in need of repair. Satellite phone inoperative, radio functional. I was just finishing the last paragraph when I heard it. A sound, outside the cabin. Not loud, barely audible in fact, but distinct. A footstep. I froze, my pen hovering over the page. The sound came again, and again. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. I set down my pen and listened. The footsteps continued, moving around the perimeter of the cabin with a measured, unhurried pace. There was no variation in the rhythm, no hesitation, no acceleration. Just step, 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 like a metronome. I stood up slowly, trying not to make any noise. I reached for the rifle I had leaned against the wall and checked that it was loaded. Then I moved to the window and looked out. The light was almost gone, and the forest was a wall of black shapes against a dark gray sky. I could see the dock, the water, the first few feet of the path that led into the trees, but I could not see anything moving. No animal, no person, nothing. The footsteps continued. I pressed my face against the glass, straining to see. The sound was coming from the other side of the cabin now, from the direction of the forest. Step, step, step. Always the same rhythm, always the same pace. I crossed to the other window and looked out. Nothing. Just trees and shadows and the impenetrable darkness of the forest at night. But the footsteps were closer now. I could hear them clearly, just outside the wall, no more than 10 feet away. Step, step, step. And then they stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, not the natural silence of the forest at night, but something deeper, something heavier. A silence that seemed to have weight, that seemed to press against the walls of the cabin like water. I stood at the window, rifle in hand, waiting. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my temples. My breath was shallow, rapid. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get out of the cabin, to get to the boat and leave this place and never come back. But I did not move. I could not move. I was frozen, trapped by something I did not understand, held in place by a force that was not physical but was just as real. And then I heard it. A voice. Samuel. My name. Spoken softly, almost tenderly, like a mother calling a child in for dinner. Spoken from just outside the window, no more than a few inches away. Samuel. I cannot describe the terror I felt in that moment. It was not the fear of physical danger. I have faced bears. I have faced storms. I have faced all the ordinary hazards of life in the wilderness. This was something different, something primal, something that reached into the deepest part of my brain and triggered instincts I did not know I had. I stumbled backward, away from the window, and tripped over the chair. I fell hard, the rifle clattering away across the floor. I scrambled to my feet and backed into the corner, as far from the windows as I could get, my eyes fixed on the glass. Samuel. The voice was moving now, circling the cabin, just as the footsteps had done. Samuel, come outside. Samuel, I want to show you something. Samuel. I grabbed the lantern from the table and held it up, as if the light could protect me. The flame flickered and danced, casting wild shadows on the walls. Through the window, I could see nothing but darkness, but I could feel it, a presence, just outside, watching, waiting. The voice continued, soft and patient. Samuel. You came here to disappear. I can help you. Samuel, I know what you are running from. I know what you did. Samuel, come outside. Let me show you. I do not know how long I stood there, in that corner, listening to the voice. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. Time had ceased to have meaning. There was only the voice, and the darkness, and the unbearable weight of the silence between each word. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The voice fell silent. The darkness outside the window seemed to recede, to thin, to become ordinary again. The pressure in my chest eased, and I found I could breathe. I slid down the wall and sat on the floor, the lantern clutched in my hands, my whole body shaking. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the corner, the rifle across my knees, and watched the windows until the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the glass. When the sun finally rose, or what passed for a sunrise in that perpetually overcast place, I got up, packed my gear, and walked down to the dock. I was going to leave. I was going to get in the boat and go back to Ketchikan and tell Franklin that he could find someone else for this assignment. I was done. I was finished. I was not going to spend another night in that cabin. But when I reached the dock, I stopped. The boat was gone. The whaler was no longer tied to the pilings. There was no sign of it, no rope, no debris, nothing floating in the water. It had simply vanished, as if it had never existed. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty space where the boat should have been. And then, slowly, I turned and looked back at the cabin. It sat there on its low bluff, surrounded by trees, quiet and still in the early morning light. And I understood, with a cold certainty that settled into my bones, that I was not leaving. Not yet. Not until the forest was finished with me. I spent the morning searching for the boat. I walked the entire shoreline of the bay, pushing through undergrowth and scrambling over fallen trees, looking for any sign of where the whaler might have drifted. I found nothing. No wreckage, no tracks, no indication that the boat had ever been there at all. By midday, I was exhausted and frustrated. I returned to the cabin and tried the radio, hoping to reach the Ketchikan station and report my situation. The radio crackled and hissed, but I could not raise anyone on any frequency. Static, nothing but static, as if the signals were being swallowed by something between me and the rest of the world. I was alone, truly alone, cut off from civilization, from help, from any possibility of rescue. The nearest settlement was 20 miles away, across water I had no way to cross. I had food for a few more days, water from the pump, shelter, but I was trapped. I sat down at the table and tried to think. There had to be a rational explanation. The boat must have come loose during the night. A faulty knot, a frayed rope, something I had overlooked. It had drifted away with the tide, and I had simply not been able to find it. The radio was malfunctioning. These things happened in remote areas, especially in weather like this. There was nothing supernatural about any of it. Just bad luck, just coincidence. But even as I told myself these things, I knew I did not believe them. I thought about the voice, the footsteps, the way my name had been spoken, with that soft, patient certainty. Whatever was happening here was not coincidence. It was intention. Something wanted me here. Something had taken the boat to make sure I stayed. I spent the afternoon gathering more firewood and taking stock of my supplies. I had enough food for 3 days, maybe 4 if I rationed carefully. The pump was working, so water was not a problem. I had the rifle and a box of 20 cartridges. I had the flashlight and extra batteries. I had matches, a knife, rope, a first aid kit. I had everything I needed to survive. But survival was not my main concern. My main concern was making it through the coming night. As the light began to fade, I barricaded the door and windows as best I could. I pushed the table against the door and wedged the chairs under the window frames. I built a fire in the fireplace, not for warmth, but for light, as much light as I could create. I placed the lantern on the table and lit every candle I could find. I wanted the cabin to be bright. I wanted there to be no shadows. I sat in the corner, the rifle across my knees, and waited. The hours passed slowly. The fire crackled and popped. The candles flickered, the wind picked up outside, and I could hear the trees creaking and swaying in the darkness. But there were no footsteps, no voice, no presence outside the windows, just the ordinary sounds of the forest at night, the wind, the rain, the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. By midnight, I began to think that the previous night had been an anomaly, a one-time occurrence, perhaps triggered by my arrival, by my disturbance of the cabin and the cellar in the journal. Maybe I had been tested, and I had passed. Maybe whatever was out there had decided I was not worth the effort. I was just starting to relax, just starting to think about trying to sleep when I heard it. Not a voice this time, not footsteps, something else. Music. Faint, distant, carried on the wind. A melody I almost recognized, played on what sounded like a fiddle or a violin. It was coming from the forest, from somewhere deep in the trees. I went to the window and looked out. The rain had stopped, and the clouds had parted enough to let through a sliver of moonlight. I could see the dock, the water, the first few rows of trees at the edge of the clearing, and I could see something else. A light, a flickering orange light deep in the forest. It was moving, weaving between the trees, appearing and disappearing, as if it were being carried by someone walking through the woods. The music continued, growing louder, clearer. I could hear it now. An old tune, something from another era, played with a skill that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. There was a wrongness to the melody, a dissonance that crept in at the edges, as if the musician were playing from a score that had been corrupted or altered. I watched the light for a long time, trying to understand what I was seeing. It was too far away to be a threat, too deep in the forest to be anything I needed to worry about. But I could not look away. There was something hypnotic about the combination of the light and the music, something that tugged at the edge of my consciousness, that whispered of secrets just beyond my understanding. And then the light stopped moving. It hovered there, in the darkness between the trees, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. The music faded, replaced by silence, and I realized, with a chill that ran down my spine, that the light was not random. It was not wandering. It was waiting. It was waiting for me to come to it. I stepped back from the window and forced myself to look away. I knew, with a certainty that came from somewhere deeper than thought, that if I went into the forest, I would not come back. Whatever was out there, whatever was making that light, playing that music, it was not human, and it did not have my best interests at heart. I returned to my corner and did not look at the window again. The music started up once more, louder this time, closer. The melody had changed. It was faster now, more urgent, with a driving rhythm that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. I covered my ears and closed my eyes, but I could still hear it, still feel it vibrating in my chest, in my bones. Samuel. The voice was back, softer than before, almost a whisper, but I could hear it clearly over the music. Samuel. Come dance with me. Samuel. I have been waiting so long. Samuel. I pressed my hands harder against my ears. I started humming, singing, anything to drown out the voice. I recited the Pledge of Allegiance, the Lord's Prayer, the lyrics to every song I could remember. I talked to myself, to the walls, to anyone who might be listening. Anything to fill the silence, anything to keep that voice from getting inside my head. And somehow, I made it through. The music faded. The voice stopped. The light in the forest winked out, leaving only darkness. When dawn came, I was still in my corner, my throat raw from talking, my hands trembling, my mind racing. I had survived another night, but I knew I could not do this forever. I knew that whatever was out there, it was patient. It had all the time in the world, and sooner or later, it would get what it wanted. On the third day, I read more of Ezekiel Marsh's journal. I had been avoiding it, reluctant to delve deeper into the mind of a man who had clearly been driven mad by this place. But I was desperate. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. I needed to know if there was a way out. The middle sections of the journal were difficult to read. Marsh's handwriting had deteriorated, becoming cramped and erratic, the letters running together in ways that made many passages illegible. But I was able to piece together the general arc of his experience. Marsh had first noticed something wrong in the winter of 1934, about 2 years after he built the cabin. He had been running his trap lines, following a route he had traveled dozens of times before, when he realized he was lost. The forest had changed. Landmarks he knew were gone, replaced by trees and rocks that he did not recognize. He wandered for hours, growing increasingly disoriented, until he stumbled, quite by accident, back to the cabin. He had been less than a mile from home the entire time. After that, the incidents increased. He would hear voices calling his name in the forest, voices that sounded like people he knew, people from his past, people who were hundreds or thousands of miles away. He would see figures at the edge of his vision, always just out of clear sight, always gone when he turned to look. He would lose time, fall asleep in the afternoon, and wake up the next morning with no memory of the intervening hours. By 1940, Marsh had developed a theory. He believed that the forest was not just a collection of trees and animals, but a living thing, a consciousness, something old and vast and patient that had existed on this island long before humans arrived and would exist long after they were gone. He called it the presence, and he believed that it was interested in him, not hostile exactly, not friendly either, just interested, the way a scientist might be interested in a specimen under a microscope. It watches me, Marsh wrote. It studies me. It is learning. I do not know what it wants, but I know that it wants something, and I know that it will not let me leave until it gets it. The later entries were fragmentary and often incoherent. Marsh wrote about conversations with the presence, long rambling dialogues that he seemed to have conducted in his dreams. He wrote about visions, images of the island as it had been thousands of years ago, before the trees, before the ice, when it was just bare rock rising from a primordial sea. He wrote about promises, things the presence had offered him in exchange for his cooperation, power, knowledge, eternal life. In return for what, Marsh never made clear. But in the final entries, there were hints. The presence needs something, Marsh wrote. Something that only a human can provide. A bridge, a doorway, a way to cross from its world into ours. And it has chosen me. In his last entry, the one I had read on my first day, Marsh seemed to have made his decision. I understand now, he wrote. I know what it wants. I know what I have to do. May God forgive me. And then he disappeared. I closed the journal and sat in the silence of the cabin, my mind racing. If Marsh was right, if there really was something in the forest, something ancient and intelligent and hungry, then I was in far more danger than I had realized. It was not just trying to scare me. It was not just playing games. It wanted something from me, and it was not going to stop until it got it. I thought about Franklin's warning. When you see it, leave. Do not investigate. Do not try to understand. Just leave. But I could not leave. The boat was gone. The radio was not working. I was trapped on an island with something that defied explanation, something that had driven one man mad and possibly killed him. I had two choices. I could stay in the cabin, barricade the doors, and wait for rescue that might never come. Or I could go into the forest. I could try to understand what I was dealing with. I could try to find a way to stop it, or at least a way to survive. Neither option was appealing, but I knew, even as I weighed them, which one I would choose. I had not come to Alaska to hide. I had come to face the things I had been running from, and if this forest wanted a confrontation, then a confrontation it would get. I left the cabin at noon on the third day. The weather had cleared somewhat, the rain had stopped, and the clouds had lifted enough to reveal patches of pale blue sky. The forest looked almost beautiful in the diffused light, the green of the trees vibrant against the gray of the rocks and the black of the still water. I brought the rifle, the flashlight, the compass, a length of rope, and a small pack with food and water. I also brought Marsh's journal, though I was not sure why. Perhaps I thought it might contain some clue I had missed. Perhaps I just wanted to have something to hold on to, some connection to another human being who had faced what I was facing. The path into the forest started at the edge of the clearing behind the cabin. It was not an official trail, just a faint track worn into the undergrowth by the passage of feet over decades. Marsh's feet probably, and the feet of others before him. I followed the path for about half a mile, pushing through ferns and ducking under low-hanging branches. The forest was dense here, the trees growing so close together that I could barely see more than a few feet in any direction. The light that filtered through the canopy was green and dim, like light at the bottom of a deep pool. I stopped frequently to check my compass and mark my trail. I did not want to get lost. I did not want to end up wandering in circles, the way Marsh had described. Every few hundred yards, I tied a strip of cloth to a tree branch, leaving a visible trail back to the cabin. After about an hour, the path began to climb. The terrain grew steeper, rockier. The trees thinned out slightly, replaced by dense thickets of devil's club and salmonberry that tore at my clothes and left scratches on my hands. I was sweating despite the cool air, my breath coming in short gasps. And then, without warning, I stepped out of the forest and into a clearing. It was not a natural clearing. The trees had been cut, recently judging by the freshness of the stumps, and arranged in a rough circle about 50 feet across. In the center of the circle was a structure, not a cabin, not a shelter, something else. It was made of wood and bone and something that looked like dried seaweed, all woven together in an intricate pattern that hurt my eyes to look at. It was about 10 feet tall and vaguely conical, like a tipi or a hut, but the proportions were wrong. The angles did not match. The whole thing seemed to shift and shimmer in the dim light, as if it were not quite solid, not quite real. I approached slowly, the rifle raised. There was no sound except the wind in the trees and the pounding of my heart. The structure had no door, no windows, no obvious opening of any kind. It was just a solid mass of woven material, dense and impenetrable. I walked around it once, twice, looking for a way in. On my third circuit, I noticed something I had missed before. There were carvings on the wooden poles that formed the structure's frame, figures, faces, scenes that I could not quite interpret but that filled me with a deep, instinctive dread. And at the base of one of the poles, almost hidden by the dense weave of the walls, there was a hole. Not a door, just a small opening about 2 feet across that seemed to lead into the interior of the structure. I knelt down and shone my flashlight into the hole. The beam revealed nothing but darkness, a darkness so complete that it seemed to swallow the light, to drink it in and give nothing back. The air coming from the hole was cold and damp, with a faint smell that reminded me of caves, of old earth, of things long buried. Every instinct I had told me not to go inside. Every rational thought screamed that this was a trap, that whatever was in there was waiting for me, that I would never come out. But I had come this far. I had left the safety of the cabin. I had walked into the forest. I had found this place, or it had let me find it. There was no turning back now. I set down my pack and the rifle. They would be useless inside that narrow space. I kept the flashlight and the knife. Then I got down on my hands and knees and crawled into the darkness. The passage was longer than I expected. 10 feet, maybe 15, a tunnel of woven branches and bone that pressed against me on all sides. The floor was soft, covered with something that felt like fur or moss. The walls were warm, which made no sense. Warm and slightly damp, like the skin of a living thing. And then the passage opened up, and I found myself in a space that should not have existed. The interior of the structure was vast, far larger than the outside dimensions could possibly allow. I stood up and shone my flashlight around, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The beam revealed walls that curved upward and outward, disappearing into darkness above. The floor was smooth, almost polished, made of some material that I could not identify. And everywhere, On the walls, on the floor, on structures and objects that I could not name. There were carvings, faces, hundreds of faces, thousands of faces, human faces, etched into every surface, each one unique, each one frozen in an expression that was impossible to read. I walked deeper into the space, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The flashlight beam played across the faces, and I began to recognize some of them. There was a man who looked like my father, who had died when I was 12. There was a woman who looked like my ex-wife, her expression distant and sad. There was my brother, my boss, my neighbors, my friends. Everyone I had ever known, everyone I had ever loved or hated or feared. And in the center of the chamber, carved larger than all the others, there was a face I knew better than any of them. My own face. I stopped and stared at it. It was perfect. Every line, every wrinkle, every scar. It was more than a carving. It was a portrait, a record, a claim. And as I stood there, looking at my own face looking back at me, I heard a sound behind me. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. I turned, raising the flashlight, and saw something that my mind refused to process. It was tall, impossibly tall, its head nearly brushing the unseen ceiling. It was thin, its limbs too long, its joints bending in ways that defied anatomy. Its skin was gray and smooth, like wet clay, and it had no face, just a blank expanse where a face should have been. But as I watched, paralyzed with terror, features began to emerge from that blankness. A mouth, eyes, a nose, my mouth, my eyes, my nose. It was wearing my face. Samuel, it said, and its voice was my voice. Welcome home. I do not know how long I stood there, frozen, staring at the thing that wore my face. It could have been seconds. It could have been hours. Time had no meaning in that place. Time was just another lie the world told itself. The thing did not move. It just stood there, watching me with my own eyes, smiling with my own mouth. Waiting. Finally, I found my voice. What are you? I asked. The thing tilted its head. My head, in a gesture that was almost human. I am what I have always been, it said. I am the forest. I am the island. I am the memory of every creature that has ever lived here, and every creature that ever will. I am the beginning and the end. I am the thing that waits. Its voice was strange, layered, as if multiple voices were speaking at once, all of them mine. It was deeply unsettling, hearing my own words come from something so alien. You have been watching me, I said, calling my name, taking my boat, trapping me here. Why? The thing smiled, my smile. It was wrong on that face, stretched too wide, held too long. Because you came to me, it said. You signed the contract. You crossed the water. You entered my domain. You are mine now, Samuel. You have always been mine. You just did not know it. I shook my head. I came here for a job, a simple job. Survey the cabin, document the wildlife, that is all. The thing laughed. My laugh, but hollow, echoing in that vast space. You came here to disappear, it said. You said so yourself. You wanted to be forgotten. You wanted to escape from everything you were. And I can give you that, Samuel. I can make you forget. I can unmake you. I can take everything you are, every memory, every regret, every fear, and absorb it into myself. You will become part of me, part of the forest, part of the island, forever. It stepped closer, and I stepped back, my heel hitting the wall behind me. I had nowhere to go. You will not suffer, it said. There is no pain in what I offer, only peace, only silence, only the end of everything that has ever hurt you. Is that not what you wanted? Is that not why you came? I thought about my life. The marriage that had fallen apart, the business that had failed, the brother I had betrayed, all the mistakes, all the regrets, all the things I wished I could undo. The thing was right. Part of me had come to Alaska to disappear. Part of me had been hoping for exactly this, an end, a release, a way to stop running. But another part of me, the part that had survived 37 years in a world that did not owe me anything, that part was not ready to give up. No, I said. The thing stopped. What did you say? I said no. I did not come here to disappear. I came here to start over, to build something new, to find out if there was still something left of me worth saving. And I am not going to let you take that from me. The thing's expression changed. The smile faded, replaced by something colder, harder. Something that was not quite anger, but was close. "You do not have a choice," it said. "You are in my domain. You are surrounded by my power. You cannot fight me. You cannot escape me. You can only accept what I offer." I tightened my grip on the knife in my hand. The blade was short, barely 6 inches. It would be useless against a creature like this, but it was all I had. "Then we have a problem," I said, "because I am not going to accept anything, and if you want me, you are going to have to take me." The thing stared at me for a long moment, and then, slowly, it began to change. The face that had been my face melted, reformed, became something else, something older, something that I recognized from the photographs in the cabin. Ezekiel Marsh. He did not resist, the thing said in Marsh's voice. He understood. He welcomed what I offered. He became part of me willingly. "And he is still here, Samuel. Still with me. Still at peace." I felt a chill run down my spine. "You killed him." "No. I freed him. He was trapped. Just like you. Trapped by his past, by his fears, by the weight of all the things he could not change. I gave him a way out. I gave him eternity. And I can give the same to you." It reached out a hand, Marsh's hand now, weathered and calloused, and touched my face. Its skin was cold, impossibly cold, like touching ice. "Just let go," it whispered. "Just surrender. It will be easier than you can imagine." And in that moment, I almost did. I felt the pull of it, the promise of oblivion, of peace, of an end to all the struggling and suffering that had defined my life. It would be so easy, so simple. Just close my eyes and let go. But then I thought about my brother, about the last conversation we had, before I left for Alaska, about the look on his face when I told him I was done, that I never wanted to see him again. I had been angry. He had been hurt. And we had parted in silence, with nothing resolved, nothing forgiven. I could not let that be the end. I could not let the last thing I did in this world be giving up. I twisted away from the thing's grip and slashed at it with the knife. The blade passed through its arm as if through smoke, and for a moment, the creature's form wavered, became translucent, then reformed. It looked at me with Marsh's eyes, and there was something like surprise in its expression. "You resist," it said, "even now, even when there is no hope." "Why?" "Because hope is not the point," I said. "The point is not giving up. The point is fighting, even when you know you cannot win. That is what it means to be human." The thing was silent for a long moment, and then slowly it began to smile. Marsh's smile, but different somehow, almost approving. "Interesting," it said, "very interesting." And then it was gone. Just like that. One moment it was standing in front of me, and the next moment I was alone in the chamber, surrounded by carved faces, with nothing but the echo of its voice in the darkness. I stood there, breathing hard, waiting for it to return. But the minutes passed, and nothing happened. The chamber remained empty. The silence remained unbroken. Eventually I turned and made my way back to the tunnel, back to the crawlway, back to the outside world. When I emerged from the structure, the sun was setting. I had been inside for hours, though it had felt like minutes. The forest was quiet, the trees dark shapes against the fading sky. I gathered my pack and my rifle and made my way back along the trail I had marked, following the strips of cloth through the darkening woods. And as I walked, I felt something I had not expected. The sense of being watched was gone. The weight that had pressed down on me since I arrived, the constant, oppressive presence of the forest, had lifted. For the first time in 3 days, I felt alone. Truly alone. It was, I realized, the greatest gift the thing could have given me. It had let me. I made it back to the cabin as the last light faded from the sky. I was exhausted, emotionally and physically drained, but I felt strangely at peace. Something had changed. I did not understand what or why, but I knew that the worst was over. That night, for the first time since I arrived, I slept. I did not dream. I did not hear voices or footsteps or music in the darkness. I simply closed my eyes and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep that lasted until morning. When I woke, I went down to the dock, half expecting to find it empty. But the whaler was there, tied to the pilings exactly as I had left it on the first day. The rope was intact, the knots secure. It was as if it had never been gone. I tried the radio, and it worked. I raised the Ketchikan station on the first try, reported my status, and requested an early pickup. Franklin himself came out to get me, piloting a larger boat through the early morning mist. He did not ask many questions. He just looked at me with those eyes that had seen too much and nodded slowly, as if he understood. On the ride back to Ketchikan, I told him what had happened. Not everything. Some of it I still could not put into words, but enough. The voices, the footsteps, the structure in the forest, the thing that wore my face. Franklin listened in silence, his hand steady on the wheel. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that I have never forgotten. "It let you go," he said. "That does not happen often. Most people who go as deep as you did, they do not come back. Or they come back different, changed, empty. You are lucky, Samuel, or blessed, or maybe you are just too stubborn to give up." I asked him what he thought the thing was, what it really was. He shrugged. "I do not know," he said, "and I have stopped trying to find out. The Tongass has been here for thousands of years, longer maybe. It has seen civilizations rise and fall. It has swallowed entire peoples without a trace. Whatever lives in those forests, whatever you encountered on Heceta Island, it is older than us, older than our understanding. And trying to understand it is like trying to understand the ocean or the stars. You can study it, you can measure it, but you can never really know it." He looked at me, and there was something like compassion in his eyes. "The best thing you can do," he said, "is accept that some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Some questions are not meant to be answered, and some places are not meant to be understood." He turned back to the wheel. "Just be grateful, Samuel. Be grateful that you made it out, and do not go back." I nodded. I understood. I never went back to Heceta Island. I finished my contract with the Forest Service, but I requested different assignments, always on the mainland, always in areas that had been thoroughly mapped and documented. I never again ventured into the unexplored corners of the Tongass, and I never again heard voices calling my name in the night. But I still think about that place. I still dream about it sometimes. The chamber under the earth, the carved faces, the thing that wore my face and spoke with my voice. And I wonder if it is still there, waiting. I wonder if it thinks about me too. I did not leave Alaska immediately after the Heceta assignment. Despite everything that had happened, I found that I was not ready to return to the lower 48. The life I had left behind was still there, waiting. The debts, the failures, the broken relationships. I was not ready to face them yet. So I stayed in Ketchikan, working smaller assignments, keeping my head down, trying to make sense of what I had experienced. And that was how I met the others. The first was a woman named Margaret Holloway. She was in her 50s, with iron gray hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from driftwood. She had worked for the Forest Service for 25 years, most of them in the Tongass, and she had a reputation for being hard to work with. People said she was cold, distant, antisocial, but I recognized something in her eyes, the same haunted look I saw in my own mirror every morning. We met by accident in a bar on Creek Street. She was sitting alone, nursing a whiskey, staring at nothing. I sat down next to her and ordered a beer. We did not speak for a long time. Finally, without looking at me, she said something that made my blood run cold. "You have been to one of the places," she said. "I can tell. The way you hold yourself, the way you flinch when someone says your name. You have seen things you cannot explain." I turned to look at her. She was still staring straight ahead, her expression unreadable. "How do you know?" I asked. "Because I have been there too," she said, "more than once, and it changes you. It leaves a mark that never quite fades." She took a sip of her whiskey. "Mine was on an island called Coronation," she said. "I was doing a salmon survey in the summer of '92. 3 weeks alone, in a cabin that had been abandoned for decades. By the end of the first week, I knew something was wrong." She told me her story. It was different from mine in the details, but the essence was the same. The voices, the sense of being watched, the loss of time, the structure in the forest, in her case, a circle of standing stones covered with carvings that hurt to look at. And at the end, an encounter with something that defied explanation, something that had offered her a choice. "I chose to stay," she said, "just like you did, and it let me go, just like it let you go. But not everyone is so lucky, Samuel. Not everyone makes it out." She finished her whiskey and set the glass down on the bar. "There are others," she said. "Other people who have been to the places and survived. We do not talk about it publicly. No one would believe us, but we know each other, we find each other, and we share what we have learned." She turned to look at me, and for the first time, I saw something like warmth in her eyes. "You are not alone," she said. "You never were, and you never will be." Over the following weeks, Margaret introduced me to the others. There was Harold Pemberton, a retired biologist who had spent 30 years studying the wildlife of the Tongass. He had encountered the presence on a remote stretch of the mainland, near a glacier that had retreated so far it had exposed ancient rock that had not seen sunlight in 10,000 years. There was Dorothy Chen, a pilot who had been flying supplies to remote cabins when her plane went down on an island that was not on any map. She had spent 3 days in the forest before being rescued, and she had never flown again. There was William Redhawk, a Tlingit elder whose ancestors had known about the places for generations, who had been raised on stories of the spirits that lived in the deep forest and the prices they demanded. Each of them had their own story, their own encounter, their own scars. But they all shared the same fundamental experience. They had all been chosen by something in the forest. They had all been tested, and they had all survived. We began meeting regularly in a back room at the bar on Creek Street. We shared our stories, compared our experiences, tried to piece together some understanding of what we had faced. We called ourselves the survivors, though we never used that name in public. And slowly, over months of conversation and research, we began to develop a theory. The places, the islands, the caves, the clearings in the forest where the presence was strongest, were not random. They followed a pattern. They were clustered around certain geographic features, ancient volcanic formations, areas of unusual magnetic activity, sites that had been sacred to the Tlingit and other indigenous peoples for thousands of years, and they were connected. Not physically, but in some other way that we could not quite define, as if they were all part of a single network, a web of power that spanned the entire archipelago. Harold called it a mycelium, like the underground network of a fungus, connecting individual mushrooms that appeared to be separate organisms, but were actually parts of a single vast entity. The places were the fruiting bodies, the visible manifestations of something much larger, something that lived beneath the surface of the forest, beneath the surface of reality itself. It was a compelling theory, but it raised more questions than it answered. What was the entity? Where did it come from? What did it want? And why did it let some people go while others disappeared forever? We did not find answers. But we found something else, something almost as valuable. We found community. We found people who understood, who believed, who did not think we were crazy. And that, in the end, was enough. I stayed in Ketchikan for 3 more years after the Hesita incident. I continued working for the Forest Service, continued meeting with the survivors, continued trying to understand the thing that had changed my life. And then, in the spring of my 4th year, something happened that forced me to leave. Dorothy Chen disappeared. She had been doing better recently. The nightmares that had plagued her since her crash had started to fade. She had even talked about flying again, about overcoming the fear that had grounded her for so long. We thought she was healing. We were wrong. The night she disappeared, she left a note at the bar. It was addressed to all of us, but the message was simple. "It is calling me," she wrote. "I have to go back. I am sorry." We searched for her, of course. The Coast Guard, the Forest Service, the state troopers, everyone searched. They found her car at a trailhead on the mainland, near the site of her crash. They found her footprints leading into the forest. And then they found nothing. Dorothy was gone. Just like Ezekiel Marsh. Just like all the others who had ventured into the places and never returned. Her disappearance hit me hard. I had thought we were safe. I had thought that surviving the encounter meant we were protected somehow, that the presence had let us go and would not call us back. But Dorothy's note suggested otherwise. The calling never stopped. It just waited. And sooner or later, it would find a moment of weakness, a crack in the armor, and it would pull us back. I realized then that I could not stay in Alaska. Not because I was afraid, though I was, desperately afraid, but because I knew that the longer I stayed, the more likely I was to hear the calling too. The Tongass was in my blood now. It had marked me, claimed me, made me part of itself in some way that I could not undo. If I stayed, I would eventually follow Dorothy into the trees. And I was not ready for that. Not yet. I left Ketchikan at the end of that summer. I said goodbye to Margaret and Harold and William, to Franklin and the others who had become my friends. I packed my few possessions into a duffel bag, bought a one-way ticket to Seattle, and walked away from the only place I had ever felt like I belonged. I have not been back since. It has been 12 years now. I live in a small town in eastern Washington, as far from the coast, as far from the forest, as I could get without leaving the Pacific Northwest entirely. I work as a bookkeeper for a local hardware store. I live alone. I do not talk about what happened. But I still think about it. Every day. Every night. I think about the cabin on Hesita Island. I think about the chamber under the earth. I think about the thing that wore my face and offered me oblivion, and I think about my friends, the ones who survived and the ones who did not. Most of all, I think about the calling. I have not heard it since I left Alaska, not once in 12 years, but I know it is still there, waiting. I know that the presence has not forgotten me, and I know that someday, maybe tomorrow, maybe 10 years from now, maybe on my deathbed, I will hear it again. Samuel, it will say, come home. And I do not know if I will have the strength to resist. Last month, I received a letter from an attorney in Ketchikan. Franklin Delacroix had passed away, peacefully, in his sleep, at the age of 75. He had named me in his will. The inheritance was modest, a few $1,000s, some personal effects, a box of old photographs. But there was one item that caught my attention, a key. The attorney explained that Franklin had owned a small piece of property on the outskirts of town, a cabin, really, that he had built himself in the 70s. He had never used it, the attorney said. He had just held on to it all those years, waiting for the right person to give it to. Apparently, I was that person. I did not know what to think. I had not spoken to Franklin in over a decade. I had sent him a Christmas card every year, and he had sent one back. But that was the extent of our contact. I had assumed he had forgotten about me, moved on, found other young rangers to mentor and warn, but he had not. He had remembered, and in the end, he had chosen me. I thought about selling the cabin site unseen. I thought about throwing the key away and pretending I had never received the letter. I thought about 100 different ways to avoid dealing with what Franklin's gift represented. But in the end, I did none of those things. I booked a flight to Ketchikan. I rented a car at the airport, and I drove out to the cabin, following the directions the attorney had given me, through the rain-soaked streets of the town and up into the hills that overlooked the harbor. The cabin was small, just one room, with a wood stove and a narrow bed, and a window that looked out over the water. It was old, weathered, covered with moss and lichen, but it was solid. It had been built by hands that knew what they were doing, by a man who understood how to create something that would last. Inside, on the table, there was an envelope with my name on it. I opened it and found a letter, written in Franklin's careful, measured hand. Samuel, it said, if you are reading this, then I am gone. Do not mourn for me. I have lived a long life, longer than I expected or perhaps deserved, and I have made my peace with whatever comes next. I am leaving you this cabin because I believe you will understand why I built it. It faces east, away from the islands, away from the forest, away from all the places where the presence is strong. I built it as a refuge, a place where I could go when the calling became too loud. I never told anyone about it. I never brought anyone here. It was my secret, my sanctuary, my last line of defense against the thing that wanted to claim me. I do not know if you still hear the calling. I do not know if the present still thinks about you the way it thought about me and about all the others. But I know that it never truly lets go. And I know that someday you might need a place to hide. This cabin is that place. Use it when you need it. Stay as long as you need to stay. And remember what I told you all those years ago. The forest does not care why you came. It only cares whether you can do the work. And the work, Samuel, is surviving. The work is refusing to give in. The work is standing up every morning and choosing to live, even when every fiber of your being is telling you to walk into the trees and let the darkness take you. That is the only victory we can hope for. That is the only thing we can control. I have faith in you, Samuel. I always have. Franklin. I read the letter 3 times, sitting in the silence of the cabin, listening to the rain on the roof. And then I set it down and walked to the window and looked out at the view. The harbor was spread out below me, gray and glittering in the afternoon light. Beyond it, I could see the islands of the archipelago, stretching away into the mist like the humped backs of sleeping giants. And beyond them, invisible but present, the vast green expanse of the Tongass National Forest. The thing was still out there. I could feel it, even now, even from this distance. A faint tug at the edge of my consciousness, a whisper so soft it was almost silence. Samuel, come home. I turned away from the window and walked back to the table. I picked up Franklin's letter and read the last paragraph one more time. The work is surviving. The work is refusing to give in. The work is standing up every morning and choosing to live. I folded the letter and put it in my pocket. Then I picked up the key and held it in my hand, feeling its weight, its solidity, its promise. I did not know what the future held. I did not know if I would hear the calling again, or when, or what I would do if I did. But I knew one thing. I was not going to give up. Not today. Not ever. I was going to survive. I was going to do the work. And if the presence wanted me, it was going to have to wait. I stayed in the cabin for a week. I told myself I was just clearing out Franklin's belongings, putting his affairs in order, doing the practical things that needed to be done. But the truth was simpler. I needed time. Time to think. Time to remember. Time to decide what came next. On the 5th day, I found something I had not expected. Hidden in a compartment beneath the floorboards, there was a journal. Not Ezekiel Marsh's journal. I had returned that to the Forest Service years ago. But Franklin's. It was thick, leather-bound, filled with decades of careful handwriting. I read it over the next 2 days, sitting by the wood stove, watching the rain fall outside the window. It was, in many ways, a history of the places. Franklin had been documenting them for over 40 years. Every encounter, every disappearance, every survivor's story he could verify. He had maps showing the locations of the structures. He had photographs of the carvings. He had transcriptions of Tlingit oral histories that described the presence in terms that predated European contact by thousands of years. And he had theories, dozens of theories, spanning the scientific and the spiritual, the rational and the mystical. Some of them were familiar: the mycelium hypothesis, the ancient entity theory, the idea that the presence was a kind of collective unconscious made manifest. But others were new to me. One theory in particular caught my attention. Franklin believed that the presence was not hostile, not exactly. It was hungry, that much was clear, but its hunger was not malicious. It was more like the hunger of a plant for sunlight or a river for the sea. It was simply trying to fulfill its nature. The presence fed on consciousness, Franklin wrote, on memory, on identity. It absorbed the minds of those who came to it, not to destroy them, but to incorporate them, to add their experiences to its own, to grow. And the people it absorbed, they were not dead. Not exactly. They were still there, somewhere inside the presence, preserved like insects in amber, still thinking, still remembering, still aware. They had simply become part of something larger. Franklin did not know if this was a good thing or a bad thing. He did not know if the absorbed minds experienced peace or torment, freedom or imprisonment. But he believed, based on his own encounters, based on the testimonies of survivors, based on the strange sense of recognition that sometimes came to him in dreams, that they were not lost, that they were, in some sense, still there, waiting. This theory changed everything. If Franklin was right, then the presence was not an enemy. It was not evil. It was simply different, so different that human categories like good and evil, life and death, did not apply. And the choice it offered, the choice between absorption and survival, was not a choice between existence and oblivion. It was a choice between 2 different kinds of existence, 2 different ways of being. I put down the journal and sat in silence for a long time. I thought about Ezekiel Marsh, who had accepted the presence's offer and walked into the forest, never to return. I thought about Dorothy Chen, who had resisted for years, but had finally heard the calling she could not ignore. I thought about all the others, the ones who had disappeared, the ones who had survived, the ones who were still out there, still fighting, still choosing to live. And I thought about myself, about the choice I had made, all those years ago, in the chamber beneath the earth, about the thing that had worn my face and offered me oblivion, about the calling that still whispered at the edge of my hearing, soft and patient and eternal. You came here to disappear, it had said. I can help you. I had refused. I had chosen to survive. But now, reading Franklin's journal, I wondered if I had understood the choice I was making. If I had known what the presence really was, not an enemy, but a kind of ecosystem, a collective consciousness that absorbed and preserved everything it touched, would I have made the same decision? Would I have fought so hard to remain myself, to remain separate, to remain alone? I did not know. I still do not know. But I know this: the choice was mine to make. And that is what matters, not the outcome, not the consequences, just the fact that I had a choice, and I made it, and I have lived with it ever since. I left Ketchikan on a Sunday morning 3 weeks after I had arrived. The rain had finally stopped, and the sky was clear for the first time since I had landed. The island sparkled in the early light, green and gold and impossibly beautiful. I drove to the airport slowly, taking the long way, savoring the view. I had decided to keep the cabin. I did not know when I would use it or if I would ever come back, but it felt important to have it, a refuge, a sanctuary, a place to run to when the calling became too loud. At the airport, I parked the rental car and walked to the terminal. I was early. My flight did not leave for another 2 hours, so I sat by the window and watched the planes take off, one after another, rising into the sky and disappearing into the distance. And as I sat there, I thought about everything that had happened: the contract, the crossing, the cabin, the chamber, the choice. I thought about Franklin and Margaret and Harold and Dorothy and all the others. I thought about the presence, whatever it was, wherever it had come from. And I thought about myself, about the man I had been before Alaska, and the man I had become since. I was not the same person. That much was obvious. The experiences I had had, the things I had seen, the choices I had made, they had changed me in ways I was still trying to understand. But I was still here, still breathing, still choosing every day to get up and face the world and do the work of living. That had to count for something. The boarding call came, and I stood and gathered my bag. I walked down the jetway and found my seat and buckled in. The plane taxied to the runway and paused, engines roaring, and then we were moving, faster and faster, until the wheels left the ground and we were airborne, climbing into the clear blue sky. I looked out the window and watched Ketchikan fall away below me. The town, the harbor, the islands, the forest, all of it shrinking, receding, becoming small and distant and finally invisible. And somewhere down there, hidden in the green shadows of the Tongass, the presence was watching. I could feel it. A faint tug at the edge of my consciousness, a whisper so soft it was almost silence. Samuel. I closed my eyes and leaned back in my seat. I did not respond. I did not need to. The presence knew where I was. It knew where I was going. And it would be waiting, patient and eternal, whenever I was ready to return. If I was ever ready. The plane leveled off, and the flight attendant came by with drinks. I ordered a coffee and a water and sat in silence, watching the clouds drift past outside the window, and I thought about what Franklin had written in the last line of his journal. The work is surviving. The work is refusing to give in. The work is standing up every morning and choosing to live. I took a sip of my coffee and smiled. The work continues, I thought, and I am not done yet. That was 2 years ago. I am back in Washington now, back in my small town, back in my quiet life. I still work at the hardware store. I still live alone. I still do not talk about what happened. But something has changed. I am no longer afraid. Not of the presence. Not of the calling. Not of anything. I have stared into the abyss, as the old saying goes, and the abyss stared back, and I survived. That does not make me special. It does not make me a hero. It just makes me someone who has seen what is out there, in the dark places of the world, and has chosen to keep living anyway. That is all any of us can do, really. Make our choices, live with the consequences, and hope that when the darkness comes, as it always does sooner or later, we will have the strength to face it. I do not know what the future holds. I do not know if I will ever hear the calling again, or if I will have the strength to resist if I do. But I know one thing. I am grateful. Grateful for the years I have had. Grateful for the experiences, even the terrible ones. Grateful for the people who helped me along the way. Franklin, Margaret, Harold, William, Dorothy, and all the others. And grateful, most of all, for the chance to tell this story. To put it down in words. To share it with anyone who might be listening. Because that is the other thing I have learned in all my years of running and hiding and surviving. The darkness is real. The presence is real. The places exist, and they are dangerous, and they do not forgive. But we are not alone. We have each other. We have our stories. We have the memory of everyone who has faced the darkness before us and survived. And as long as we remember, as long as we tell the stories and pass them on, the darkness cannot win. It can take our bodies. It can absorb our minds. But it cannot take our words. It cannot silence our voices. It cannot erase the record of our existence. And that, in the end, is the only immortality that matters. Not the eternity the presence offers. Not the absorption, the preservation, the endless continuation within a collective consciousness. Just this. Words on a page, a story told, a memory preserved. My name is Samuel Whitmore. I was a ranger in the Tongass National Forest. I encountered something I cannot explain, and I survived. That is my story, and now it is yours.